Hello, friends. My name is Host Eric. I am the host of Talking with Famous People and the world's foremost, premier, and most accurate typologist. And today I'm going to be discussing Rachel's serotonin syndrome, which has made all that foregoing seem kind of irrelevant in the face of something that was rather scary medically. Namely, that Rachel basically lost the ability to use her hands and feet correctly or well or without dropping stuff constantly, etc. She became numb from basically almost the waist down and had trouble walking. It still has trouble walking. It still has trouble with all these things, okay? So it's dramatic. It's a dramatic, super scary phenomenon with no clear physical cause to it, right? Now, it is a case that at this point we know for sure that she has serotonin syndrome. We understand that the symptoms last 3 weeks for her because of the SSRI she's on. And it creates this really weird, rare kind of thing that is comparable to a broken limb. When somebody has a broken arm for 3 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever, everybody has to get used to the fact that they can't do the things they're normally able to do. Let's say they've got a broken dominant arm. Well, then maybe they can't take notes in class if they're a kid in school or something, or maybe they're limited in their ability to do their work at their job if they're an adult. And there's an understanding that both we need to make an accommodation for this because it's temporary, not permanent, so we can make an accommodation for it, and that the other person can't really be blamed because they're literally physically unable to do these things. It's pretty obvious to everybody because they've got a big cast on their arm. Now, with serotonin syndrome, of course, there's no such cast, and it's obvious only when it causes a problem. Which is to say, I do notice Rachel all the time stumbling, having trouble putting things on, dropping things, etc. But in between those moments, it's easy to forget about. So, after a few days, what NI said was, oh shit, there's something really wrong with me. Which SI would have said right away. But that's because NIDOM, Rachel INFJ, takes a long time to process the data her body is sending her. She's very unconscious about it in the 8th slot. SI said, oh shit, maybe this is something we should start worrying about because I wasn't experiencing it myself. She was. And she wasn't reporting to me very well how serious it was. After about a week, NI said, I'm going to grieve over my former self because this is apparently permanent. After all, there's been a week with no substantive change, and that means it's probably not going to change if it works like normal things do. SI said, hold on a second, we need to evaluate how it is changing, if it is changing, and that might be minor distinctions in your capacity to move or whatever, but if it's getting better, well, regardless, I'm not willing to give up on the fact that we're going to solve this problem. This is ridiculous. I know that it's been a week now, but, Then after 2 weeks with diagnoses, doctor's visit, etc., and a lot more research, NI understood that these symptoms were not permanent because all the research explained exactly what was going on, and that in fact it was going to last for 3 weeks, but that after that she'd be fine, there'd be no lasting impacts. SI, me, increasingly begins to doubt that. Because even though I did all that research and we actually made the shit happen, it doesn't feel like it's getting especially better. Now I am having trouble distinguishing between how severe her impacting was at the beginning of the thing versus how severe it is now, because the whole time she's got FE tool function, she's trying basically not to be a bother to me with her limited abilities. And in fact, probably understating, just to not be a burden, what's going on, to the extent that she's capable of accurately stating it not really hammering the point home is important, right? So, as her significant other, I'm well equipped to help her, but poorly equipped to realize I need to, and vice versa. She's actually well equipped to provide me information I need, but poorly equipped to realize she needs to. And so then after 2 weeks, she gets the fact now that she's going to get better, and I find myself still in this weird kind of epistemological gray area. I'll really believe it when I see it, right? I will really believe it when I see it. But I will say that if anybody were to say we should treat like that, that we'll believe it when we see it, then I would say that's ridiculous. There's absolutely no reason to think this is going to last more than the 3 weeks indicated. Nevertheless, I continue checking with Rachel to see if, in fact, there's incremental improvement. And Rachel continues to display the NI not getting of SI data and time, and how SI data and time link. So I'm asking her, well, are you improving? And she said, yes, well, I was able to the other day when I tried to. I was proud of myself. And I said, well, when was that? And she said, like a few days ago. So I'm asking her for information, right, about, so how are you now? Are you better than you were this morning? Are you better than you were yesterday night or whatever? And she says, yes, there's been incremental improvement. I remember a few days ago, I attempted something that presumably previously she hadn't been able to do, and I was able to do it, and I was proud of myself, and I was happy. So, in other words, at that point, she established that, in fact, incremental improvement was being made, so she no longer needed to really keep track of instances of incremental improvement being made. She generalized it. And it probably was sufficient to make her realize, oh, I've got confirmation from the SI with testing from the SE, because I'm not necessarily great about consciously directing attention to it. So the issue of whether or not incrementality is occurring is resolved, and my SI supports my NI. Good, I'm satisfied. Now, I too need both SI and NI satisfaction, but I'm not experiencing incremental improvement in the same frame of reference as she is. So not only am I not experiencing it directly, but when I'm asking about, well, are you showing incremental improvement, I'm assuming she's on an ongoing basis checking and updating her status about these things that matter a lot, namely how she's SI experiencing her body at the moment. Of course, that's not her way because she's not an ENTP. So, now let's go on here to number 2. For 2 status types, statuses dictate the frame. So for both of us, we're looking to the statuses to understand how we act right now with each other. And this is one of the reasons why I've been somewhat emotionally fraught, is these statuses have been up in the air, right? So what I realized today is, because it's stretched on for so long, I have basically begun approaching it as though it were permanent. Namely, all right, well, time to start figuring out what you can do, and stop being handicapped or whatever. But of course, that's not true. She's got a 3-week-long sickness that's going to impact her ability to function for 3 weeks. If it were permanent, I'd be right. Okay, we need to start framing this not so much in terms of what can Eric do for you, as what can you do for yourself. Because Eric can't do everything for you, and we're going to have to be a little bit more independent than that. I understand, however, that it's frustrating for you trying to do anything when it's harder than it should be, right? However, if it's temporary, which it is, then I need to be a good partner and just say, buck up and say, you don't need to do anything. I'll do everything I can for you. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about spilling shit and stuff. I should have carried it for you anyway. That's my bad. I can do that for 3 weeks. No problem. And ought to behave accordingly, because it is the case. It's not up in the air at all that it's not going that it will go away and there will be no lasting effects of it. It's a weirdly perfect storm of teaching a hard lesson without any long-term consequences, which is the story of my life. The story of my life. Now, I get this is happening to Rachel, but it's teaching me just as much as it's teaching Rachel. So, okay. Now let's talk a little bit about the Prime Directive. And I got typed in session in 9 minutes, so I'm going to have to wrap this up. The Prime Directive frames extroverted intuition as I need to be able to expect to think outside the box at least enough, when necessary, to improvise myself out of a tough spot when I fail to anticipate this thing is happening. The Prime Directive, remember, is closing the gap between the map and the reality, your expectations and your realities, what you can anticipate correctly and what totally blindsides you. People hate being surprised. So why then is extroverted intuition even a cognitive function? How does that fit under the Prime Directive? Well, the Prime Directive drives conscious beings to express as a configural approach towards the Prime Directive. One configural approach is to maximize the ability to improvise out of a tough spot when you fail to anticipate something. Now, you can maximally do that with linguistic and communicative things. So, as a consequence, extroverted intuition, when it's on the front stack, is necessarily means extroverted sensing on the back stack, because that's the other kind of action function. And it just doesn't, you basically can't prioritize novelty in real actions without failing to uphold the Prime Directive, which ultimately constrains everybody. Societies manifest the Prime Directive as the enforcement of some individual protections upon everybody. So if you look at a country like Japan, they've tried to eliminate unanticipatability of other people and their behavior by rigidly enforcing a specific hierarchy. Since it is true that older people have more experience to draw from, then let's always respect the older person in decision-making protocols. That's fair, at least, because everybody gets to be old. Validates on some sort of TI ground, but most importantly, what it validates on is an SI ground, that experience matters. It, to a certain extent, undervalues, then, the truth. In other words, if there's a group of people and one of them is best qualified, but not the oldest, they're unlikely to do the job if they're best qualified by merit in terms of most likely to get the job done well. But of course, if it doesn't uphold that reverence for SI that's built in as kind of an FE thing, then it will, the mechanisms of societal reinforcement will cause it to not be the best solution anyway. Our real representatives in life, therefore, are our advocates in the public, in the marketplace of ideas. So you'd say, who are my advocates? Like South Park. South Park is advocating my perspective, more or less, on life, which is that, okay, if INTJ says everybody's doing everything wrong, ENTP says everybody's saying everything wrong, and understanding how to use words incorrectly. And that's basically what South Park's all about. It's about people either failing to use words correctly, being fooled by dumb words, using words to rile up people to do dumb shit, and other misuse of language. So whatever television show and stuff you think represents your perspective, that's your real advocate, that's your real representative, not the person you vote for, who definitely doesn't represent your positions, right? You can find someone out there who is a good representative of your basic frame of reference positions on life, but you're never going to be able to elect them for office in general. I mean, every once in a while, maybe, if you're lucky. Okay. Our epistemology functions define the strengths of our relationships, communication, and symbolic representation in general. So these are your epistemology functions are TI, FI, SI, NI. Your introvert functions are your epistemologies because they are ways of judging and ways of knowing. The generation of novelty means the any block types are inherently outsiders. So for INFPs, ENFPs, INFPs, ENFPs, upholding our prime directive is zero sum because we prioritize being more novel than everybody else. That means when we attain closure of the gap between our map and territory, it's at the expense of somebody else's prime directive widening. Now, one of the presumptions of the ENTP, like to me, is that if I widen your gap, you'll close it by bringing your map closer to where it should be, not by deprioritizing the map even more or something, or by saying maps don't matter and just focusing on the concrete or something like that. But that may very well be what ends up happening. Okay, I've got only 3 minutes left. So, is Polar also Secret Wizard? Well, yeah, I'm playing with this idea that at the end of the day, the last person who stands up for the inherent value underlying your polar function, a given function, is the person who has it polar. So the last line of defense, the real last line of defense for FI is ESTP, ENTP. The real last line of defense for NI is ESTJ and ESFJ. The real last line of defense for TE is INFJ and ISFJ. And it's hard to explain how it plays out in all of those various types, although I just have this intuitive sense that it's correct. But for ENTP and ESTP, we are very... At the end of the day, we are going to make sure that feelings get respected. Because while they ought not be involved in rational discourse about public policy in any meaningful sense at all, they ought be involved in most arguments. And because we're so childlike with our FI, we recognize, hey, somebody's really getting hurt here in a way that that other types maybe don't. Now, I would say that ESTP most protects, is the final defender of FI on a physical impact level. Hey, you're really making a lot of trouble for this person. You're causing a lot of direct harms in their life. And ENTP is the last line of defense for word-based FI. Okay, that's just, now you're just being hurtful. We don't insult people's man, we don't meow, right? So, expand accordingly. I've got to go. I've got a typing session. If he records or she records, then I don't know who it is. But if they record, then I will upload it as soon as we're done.